Hello everyone, I'm back, and this time we're talking about the Canterbury Tales. And I'm going to be honest, because I'm never going to be anything less than honest with you guys. Not the most interesting work of literature in the world, not the most exciting work of literature in the world. Couldn't even find an interesting picture to put up on my computer screen, but it is an important work of early British literature, so we have to talk about it. Like I said, basically it's a long, what we're going to be talking about is a long list of people. And to understand why that's important, we got to get a little background information. The story of Canterbury Tales is written by Geoffrey Chaucer. He lived from 1343 to about 1400. He worked on this for most of the end of his life, and he never actually finished the Canterbury Tales. True story. Chaucer kind of just disappears from history. Like, we're not really totally 100% sure what happened to him. I don't know if any of you guys know Monty Python, Knights of Neep, Holy Grail, Life of Brian, that Flying Circus, that sort of thing. One of the guys in Monty Python, I want to say it was Terry Jones, became super obsessed with Chaucer. He got his PhD in medieval literature and kind of wrote a couple books, I think, on what happened to Chaucer. I actually saw him give a talk on one of those books like 10 or so years ago. But that's neither here nor there. To understand why we're spending time talking about a giant list of people, I got to give you some, like I said, some background information. I'm going to start off with a bold statement. Big, screaming bold statement. If you had to pick the most important year in the history of the world, like the big thing, the most important year, you couldn't go wrong by saying 1066 AD. And I know we're like rewinding a little bit from, when Chaucer was alive, but there's a build-up coming here. In 1066 AD, something happened that changed the course of European and, by extension, world history forever and ever. It was called the Norman invasion of Britain. And what ended up happening was the north coast of France, that's directly across from Britain, Normandy, World War II, Normandy. The reason it's got its name Normandy is because it was settled by Vikings, the Norse, who moved in and settled the north coast of France. Norse became Norman. The Norse intermarried with the French people there and effectively became French. 1066 AD, this gentleman with the very ambitious name William the Conqueror decided he was going to invade Britain. Remember, if you think back to the first video I made for you guys, I said Britain was only successfully invaded twice in the history of the world. First was by the Romans. This is the second time. William the Conqueror lived up to his name and conquered Britain. Now, this had a couple of effects, a couple of impacts. You get invaded, there's going to be some impact. Politically, Britain was now effectively ruled from France. This is one of the many reasons the British and French don't get along. It all dates back to 1066. I guess grudges live a long time. So politically, Britain essentially became a French colony, and it eventually took the 100 Years' War for Britain to get rid of that French political influence. So politically, France ruled Britain. For our purposes, the cultural impact was more important. When you get invaded, the invading army brings things over with it. Yes, it brings over troops and the military, blah, blah, blah. But other stuff comes too. Basically, the French culture and the French language migrated to Britain. Example of French culture and French stories? Well, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight has its origins in France. Okay. The other cultural impact, and this is for us is super important, is the English language, which was Old English. Remember Beowulf, Dream of the Rood, Caedmon's Hymn was written in Old English, and Old English was essentially a mix of all those languages we talked about. A little bit of Celtic, a little bit of Latin, a little bit of Anglo, a little bit of Saxon, a little bit of Goth, Visigoth, Jute, all those languages mixed together. Now you have a hard influx of a French linguistic influence. And that influence was so important, was so profound, it changed Old English to Middle English. Now, how did the language change? Now, that's a whole other course right there, but I can give you two examples. One, and this is 90% true, The French language gave a grammatical structure to English. It gave kind of a shape to it. It started imposing different rules of grammar. It also introduced French words into that mix, and there were so many French words introduced to that mix, and along with the change in structure, it changed Old English to Middle English. Now, we see a little bit of that impact today in our English language. Because the French were we'll talk a little bit more about this later, because the French were in charge, they became the upper class, the aristocracy. And they started using the French language. Now, the lower class people, the peasants, if you will, more or less clung to their Old English words. And the best way you can see this is, believe it or not, food. Chicken is also called poultry. Poultry was the French aristocratic word for chicken. Chicken was the Old English lower class word. When you eat cow, you don't say you eat cow, we eat beef or buffet, which was the French word, was the French upper class word for it. Beef, French upper class, cow, lower class. Deer meat is venison. Venison was the French upper class word. Deer was basically the Old English lower class word. The only food you don't really see this with is fish, because fish was seen as the food of the lower class, so the French upper class did not have a word for it. So point being, the French language changed the Old English language so much and so profoundly with these influx of words and this new structure that it became Middle English. It's one important thing. The other important thing, and sort of a result of this, was society started breaking down into three different classes. You had the aristocracy, who was largely French, spoke the French language. You had the clergy, or the religious people, who spoke Latin, that was the language of the church. And then you basically had everybody else, the whole rest of society. They were the ones who spoke Middle English. They were the ones who spoke this hybrid of Old English with the French influence. Why Canterbury Tales is important, it is the first major important work of literature that's written in that language that everybody else could read. Before Canterbury Tales, if you were going to write something, well, you probably either wrote it in French for the nobility to read or in Latin for the clergy to read. Canterbury Tales is the first work written with the express purpose of a mass audience that everybody could read. Why did Chaucer decide to do this? Well, our best guess is Chaucer's dad was in the clothing industry, the fashion industry. That's why if you read the Canterbury Tales, there's a lot of emphasis on what the characters are wearing. Chaucer had an eye for fashion. He went to Italy, sometimes with his dad, sometimes by himself, to look for new fashions. I guess Italy was on the cutting edge of fashion back then too, with not like Versace and stuff like that. A fun fact, the logo of Versace is Medusa. But he went to Italy to look for fashions, stay on the cutting edge. And while he was there, he encountered, have you ever heard of Dante's Inferno? The guy who wrote Dante's Inferno, Dante, also wrote something called the Decameron, which was written in the popular language of Italy. And Chaucer was like, hey, that's a really good idea. I want to write something for everybody to read. So he went back to England and he started writing the Canterbury Tales, not in French, the language of the nobility, not in Latin, the language of the church, but in Middle English, which was the language of everybody else. And that's super, super important. This was the first widely accessible piece of literature written in English. It's also important for another reason, something called satire. And if you've never heard of satire before, what satire is, basically, it's an exaggeration. It takes a problem, like a real problem, and exaggerates it to ridiculous proportions, not for people to take it seriously, but to at least call attention to the problem. Real problem, exaggerating it to ridiculous, over-the-top, overblown proportions, not for people to believe that that's how bad the problem is, but just for people to acknowledge the problem. I'll give you two examples, one from history and one from modern popular culture. Historical example first. This guy named Jonathan Swift was writing during a time, I think the 1700s, something like that, when there was two problems going on in Britain. One was overpopulation. Way too many people. Other was starvation. Not enough food. They kind of go hand in hand. When you have a lot of people, you don't have a lot of food. Jonathan Swift wrote this essay called A Modest Proposal, where he had the idea, I could solve both problems, I could kill two birds with one stone. What you do is you eat the newborn babies. That controls population and gives food to people who were starving. Did he really intend for that to be taken seriously? No. Of course not. He was not endorsing cannibalism and infanticide, but what he was doing was calling attention to two very real problems, overpopulation and starvation. Did not want to be taken seriously, but at least wanted people to acknowledge the problem. Other example from modern popular culture I can give you is one of my all-time favorite television shows, The Office. One of the things that America does way better than Britain. Our version of The Office is better. I call your attention to the former boss of Dunder Mifflin, Michael Scott. Does anybody in the real world have a boss that's as out there and just crazy as Michael Scott? No, probably not. No one like that would ever function as a boss in a company. But everybody has a boss that's a little bit like Michael Scott, that does one or two things sort of like Michael Scott, and that's what a satire is. Takes something real and exaggerates it to call attention to it. And what Chaucer does is he takes those three segments of society, the aristocracy, the clergy, and everybody else, and sort of pokes fun at them, points out, exaggerates their flaws, their shortcomings, the problems with them, to an exaggerated proportion, but at least to get people acknowledging and thinking about them. And one of the questions I want you guys to keep in mind when you're reading the Canterbury Tales, aristocracy, clergy, everybody else. Which of those three segments of society comes out looking the worst? Which of those three segments of society do you think Chaucer says there has the most problems, has the most issues with them? That's one of the big questions. It's probably going to end up being one of the discussion post questions. And the other thing I want you to keep in mind is you're going to meet a really diverse group of people, like a really diverse group of characters. Well, they're from all over the map, all over the social strata, all over. What's bringing them together? What's causing this diverse group of people to come together? Keep those two things in mind when you're checking out the Canterbury Tales, and I'll check back in with you guys in my recap video. Thanks.